Hello, everybody at home. I'm Nicole, the manager at It Again Bookstore, and tonight I'm also one of the poets reading for you alongside Rana Tahir. We've had Rana on our channel before as a children's book author, so you should all go check out her discussion with Kim about her Choose Your Own Adventure novel. And the way the formatting is going to work tonight, each of us will read for 15 minutes, followed by a discussion on craft. Viewers, feel free to make comments or ask questions throughout, and we'll respond to them at the end of the readings. Rana has kindly volunteered to go first, so I'll introduce her. Rana Tahir is a Kundiman Fellow and author of 2 books, the Choose Your Own Adventure one and a biography on County Cullen. She received her MFA from Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon in 2015, and she currently teaches writing and research at Pacific. Okay, Rana, when you go full screen, you may begin.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to everyone who's here and watching. So I want to start off by saying Eid Mubarak. It is officially Eid al-Adha, and I'm going to read. I will write in front of you right now. This will be brilliant. I'm going to read a poem that is about as closest to an Eid poem I've ever written. I thought it'd be appropriate, so here we go. Off the knife. How I dared to eat food directly off it, lick the edge to see if it could cut. How I chopped heads or feet of baby carrots and lettuce snapped. When renovating the bathroom, I poked at the exposed metal piping, thought how hard it would come down. In the living room, 2 missile shells held fake sunflowers. When empty, they tipped over easily and echoed as I held in them. When sleeping, we're just practicing. A bullet left over years ago stands at attention as if shot out again on the display case with the crystal knickknacks by the dining table. Using nylon ropes, my family leashed the sheep at Eid as it sat in the garden before we brought out the knife again. So this poem actually comes from a series that I was working on a while ago and I'm still currently working on. But it's about the first Gulf War, basically the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, which is where I grew up. I grew up in Kuwait. And I went through and conducted a bunch of interviews with people and then turned those interviews into paintings and poems. And so this is one of those. This next one is not one of those. But most of the poems I'll read tonight are from that collection because on Sunday, it will be the 30th anniversary of the first day of invasion for Kuwait. So it's kind of a milestone. And I thought my poems would be appropriate for that. This next one is not connected, but actually it is about that same display case from the first poem. So that was the transitional thought there. It's called Belief. I never could hold the taxidermy turtle without wincing at the decay that was not there. Instead, I took down the conch shell with its former inhabitants, dried and disintegrated, and pressed it to my ear, hearing a faint shushing sound, when really it came from the waves outside, which died down every night as the gulf receded to reveal the slimy, foam sand that turtles could be born in, might be born in, will be born in. When the Adhan breaks across the sky, the seas come back to prey. I will believe most things easily. I will believe the turtle is alive and the conch shell controls the sea, and that prayer leads to answers, because what's worse, knowing that dead things sit in the chest, damp from polish, that an empty home filters the sounds from outside, that my father's rage comes in waves, or believing that if I am good enough, I could press my ear to his chest and know. Okay, so we'll go back to that series that I was talking about. And this poem is titled Highway 80. For those who don't know, Highway 80 is a highway in Kuwait that leads into Iraq. It was also called the Highway of Death because as Iraqi soldiers were retreating when the coalition forces came in to liberate Kuwait, they were followed and basically bombed upon all along that highway. So it was kind of the site of a massacre. And it's a road that I've been on many times. Highway 80. We drive down the highway to Basra, specifically for the vendors who sell fruit out of the backs of their trucks. My father stops on the emergency lane behind a Toyota with a faded license plate, and three dusty boys look over at me when I lock myself in. The truck is white, like the one my father will later tell me was run over by Iraqi soldiers, the family inside pouring out the closed doors. In the front seat, I drown out the sounds of bargaining with Voice of America and wait, fingers ready to unlock his door and drive away, but he lingers. Later at home, he will say, what Saddam suffered was nothing compared to his crimes, and he will slice and blend watermelon into juice, red froth forming on top of every glass. So the reason that I wanted to work on this series is because the Gulf War has always been, and for most young people in Kuwait or who grew up in Kuwait that are of my age, I was born in 1991, so directly after the invasion, directly after liberation. But for a lot of us, the war was kind of a shadow hanging over us. Obviously, we didn't experience it. And for, especially during my interviews, what I found was just a lot of people just did not want to talk about what happened to them or what they saw or even just the general things about the war. And so getting people to open up when I was conducting the interviews, this was about 20 years later. So I was in college at the time when I was working on this. It was really interesting to sort of be persistent and be pushy and really just get the stories out. I knew a little bit specifically about my parents' stories because my mom would talk about it a little, but my dad would never talk about it. And I used the excuse that this was for school and I was getting graded on it. So that, you know, my parents were very adamant that we did well in school, my siblings and I. So this was a great way to sort of get the story from his side. And actually, that was kind of my in for a lot of the people I interviewed, was just kind of this like, oh, this is an official thing that I'm doing for school. I'm not just picking at this bad memory for you. But so this poem comes out of one particular interview where the person I was talking to was very, very cautious and really did not want to get into a lot of what he actually experienced. Eventually, we worked our way there. When asked about his worst memory, he said he didn't want to go back 20 years, using his fingers to show how his heart would explode into miniature fireworks. The estimate comes down to 600 missing. The estimate comes to a son flying off a bridge. In one interview, another man tells me what he lost: an unborn first child, his father. He, in an attempt to be brief, lists all the people in a war who died from normal things: a stroke, an accident, sadness. Yeah, so this next poem I'm not really going to give much of an intro to. I'll just say that I was specifically asked by this person to turn off the camera. All these interviews were filmed for my use later. I'm not sharing those. That was an agreement that was made with people I interviewed. But this was such an interesting piece that I just had to get this down into a poem. And I don't speak Arabic very well. So, and many of my subjects, not all, but many, didn't speak English very well. And so it was interesting to try and get to as close as possible the language, because the way that this person shared the story was just so interesting that aside from line breaks, I really didn't play much with it. This is called Off Camera. One time, he said, my wife and me sitting in house, then Iraqis coming. He say, give me the water. My wife pouring the water, and he touching something for my wife. He taking something bad, and he touching her, and he wants drinking the water. This next poem is, again, from the same series, but one interesting thing about the war in Iraq, part of my project was I did a ton of research on the war itself, and also on the occupation and the things leading up to it before I went in with my interviews. The interviews were really the last piece before I could start making the art. And one thing that I learned that was very interesting was that the entire invasion was very, I'll say half-assed, I guess, in a way. Because what ended up happening was many of the Iraqi troops who were sent in, they did not have ammunition, they did not have weapons, they didn't even have shoes or uniforms. And so it was really hard to tell who was who and what they were there for, aside from the first initial burst. And many of the soldiers didn't want to be there, right? This wasn't their choice. This was an invasion that was forced upon them as much as it was forced upon Kuwait and Kuwaitis and people who lived in Kuwait, like my parents. And so it was an interesting thing to think about these soldiers and their place in this war. And so this is what came out of it. This poem is called Lost Boys. Because they were unwell and had no shoes, a man losing his hair gave young boys food. Dry lipped, early fall, heat hurried over from summer, many not wearing uniforms for the misery they carried. He said he didn't approve, but Iraqi soldiers at checkpoints would ask from the guttural for, please, some food, because they were ill and had no shoes, and please, were far from home, please, some money, of kindness. Okay, so the last two poems that I'm going to read are, this was all like a little bit older work. This is much more, what I'm going to read are more recent poems, I would say. I'm working on a series right now, and if you follow me on social media, you may have seen me post about this once in a while. But I'm building my own tarot deck. I read tarot, I've been reading tarot for years, and I've decided to actually start building my own deck. And originally it was going to be a mermaid tarot deck where each of the cards had some story of a mermaid or the figures of mermaids. But as I started working more, I realized that each suit is going to be a story that resonates with me. And so the suit that I'm working on right now is the suit of cups. And that is really charged along the story of The Little Mermaid, which is a story that I've always had a lot of affinity for throughout my life, and even more so as an immigrant here in the United States. So this next poem is from that, so it references tarot, mermaids, and then also like other symbols that mean something to me. And yeah, here we go. The Mermaid, 3 Swords, and 2 Poems. Losing my belief in prophecy and princes, Kali are the steps to dances she teaches me free. I sit with my toes in the ghostly puddles by the red hibiscus. My tongue becomes ashes, my blood the air will see. Throw my head back and violently swallow the clouds. And then this last poem is also from that mermaid series, The Mermaid and 7 Staves. I want to shave my head and go back to my sisters, but we are all turning into sea foam. From the terrace of his bedroom, I can see each one along the banks, building up like palaces. One sister, with only half her face still solid, watches another cutting off her frothing fingers to save herself. All this because I could not cut her throat, that other woman who is also me. She can lie in his arms at night and stare blankly in the dark. She can calm his worries with rose water and honeycomb. I cannot. I am changeable as the ocean, indecisive, but in love nonetheless. Thank you.
That was so great. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to read, and Rana is going to read my bio.
Yep. And hey, so Nicole Yackley is a poet and artist from Georgia. Her poetry has been published in Belletrist magazine and Phoenix Literary magazine, among others, and adapted into a chamber piece that would have been performed at Carnegie Hall this coming October, pre-pandemic. She has a BA in English from the University of Georgia and an MFA in poetry from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where she studied under Joy Harjo. More of her poetry can be found at worldsofwords.tumblr.com.
Thanks. Okay. Well, I'm going to begin with a poem that I chose to connect with Rana's because they both deal with writing about family trauma. So this reading is going to start heavy, but I promise it'll get lighter. This is called Undressing My Mother, after Robert Haas. I talk in storms, in myth to skirt the subject. What I have to say is said in whispers in closed rooms while my brother or sister stand guard at the door. The worst of it is, she's going to read this. The worst of it is, she reads everything I write. Her body is not novelty. I have seen the mirrors of my mother stacked endlessly upright as she undresses in the evening. I have followed the trajectory of my own shape as it parades past windows I imagine the Lomans have been shocked into ignoring. Look at my mother in the mirror, where she's harmless. Did this power of hers to meet your eye as she removes her bra, to hold a conversation stepping out of lace underwear, begin in hospital? Leave your hand too near, unattended, and she will press it to the hollow in her breast where the port was following the blood clot. What does she want me to believe? I have come to know it doesn't take a wholeness to survive. Pray for us, sisters, now and at the hour of. I was the one who found her, my dad adding more Italian seasoning to the burgers than he could get away with her in the kitchen, leaving out the Worcestershire sauce altogether. The three of us in the living room, close enough to smell the sizzle, far enough not to have to help, and my brother volunteered for me to check on her. Looking back, she was naked. She couldn't have been, looking back, just woken from a nap, a stop by the bathroom before dinner, but her presence in my mind feels naked, pale against the red, against the tile, slumped on the floor, as pale as the tile. Dad told me to call 911. I handed him the phone. Pray for us, sisters, that now is not the hour of. What is secret? What is sacred? Who gave you the right to enter the bathroom, to soak your socks in my mother's blood and track it on the tile? Did I open this door to avoid my anger? This was after the surgery, after my parents' banquet without my parents, my brother making me laugh on the drive, absence drowning in denial. There is a letter hidden in my drawer where she says goodbye. There have been too many times my brother watched me cry. A year to the day, my mother drove us to the banquet and she was cruel and I cried. She made me hug her and in my mind she was anesthetized and under a knife and I wanted to hug a different her and I didn't want to hug her. The worst is she's going to read the worst of it, everything I write. My mother is most vicious when she feels turned upon. Don't look at her directly. In the mirror, she is breakable and therefore human. Follow the silver of her scars. She jokes they should put a zipper in for next time. I am not afraid of her nakedness or the seam where they took the cancer out, gave her a metal heart. How is it continually surprising that my mother isn't nice? Sickly sweet, sure. Southern belle, sure. Bird watcher, nature lover, yes, all these things and more. I have been blessed with the best of parents. It is sacrilege to speak against her. What gives me the right to unzip her for you? To shove my mother to the center of the room and turn the AC on until the point is clear? Does stranding her in the cold afford us clarity? I love my mother. After the cancer and the surgery, the chemo, radiation, the blood clot and the bypass, after the cruelty and the tears and the distance now to say this without a sibling at the door standing guard. There have been too many times we almost said goodbye. This is a catalog of when you made me cry. Stay for us sisters, now and forever. Okay, the rest of the poems I'll read tonight are about the Minotaur in the modern world. The Minotaur is a creature from Greek mythology with the head of a bull and the body of a man who is locked in a labyrinth in Crete. He was the son of a queen and a bull that Poseidon cursed for her to lust after, and Daedalus, the inventor of Icarus's wings, made it happen and then built a labyrinth to house him in. They sent in sacrifices for him to eat until the princess and his half-sister Ariadne got a crush on one of the sacrifices, Theseus, and gave him strings so he could find his way out, and when he was in there, he murdered the Minotaur. In my version, the Minotaur is not dead, and instead he's been stuck in the labyrinth all this time, and now he's released into today's world where he's having trouble adjusting. Okay, this one also deals with mothers. The Minotaur visits his mother. My mother cuts my meat for me, the knife sinking in the turkey, and I'm in the maze again, playing what I thought was a game as the two of us chased the children of Attica. She cut my meat for me then, too. That first girl cornered and screaming until it didn't seem like a game anymore. My mother turning with blood on her knife saying, "Honey, don't cry, have something to eat, you'll feel better." I've learned better when my mother says it means human. Something to eat meant human too. She hands me the plate and the weight of it shocks me back to my body standing in my mother's kitchen with her eyes on me. "It's nice of you to visit," she says. "I don't see enough of you anymore. I almost wish I could keep you here. Lock the door." And she chuckles as if captivity were an inside joke. I eat my turkey and do feel a little better. So this next poem came about because someone in my creative writing class complained that I use questions too much in my poetry, which is true. But I asked my teacher, Joy Harjo, what I should do about that, and she said to lean into it and write a poem entirely made out of questions. So here goes. The Minotaur looks into online dating. Where will I find someone monster as me? Is there an app for it? Half man, half bull seeks other half. Is it catfishing if I only post a picture of my torso? How many more hybrid animals can we involve? 2 turtle doves? A ladybug? Cowbird? Whale shark? Clownfish? How about a platypus? What if we all walked into a bar together? Could we carve out a space for the in-between from the mainstream? Would it read as the start of a joke? Would we end as the butt of one? The Minotaur attends movie night, hides behind his hands during sex scenes. Joining creatures together, I know, makes a monster. Look at me, horned and hairy, halved if not hooved. I don't have to tell you it was a difficult birth. The world didn't want me in it. On screen, the scene isn't finished. In between my fingers is still only flesh. I'm self-aware enough to see this wasn't written with me in mind. No panel lined a table to discuss how it would play for a man who spent lifetimes locked away trying not to be a beast. Or perhaps the bleats sound too close to those torn from similar throats as they're being eaten. Thoughts I've tried to lock away. Screams I don't want in my dreams again now my hands are clean. Especially here, on a sofa with friends I'm just learning to trust, not to break when I touch them. Brianna touches me on the arm and asks if I'm okay. I remember to pretend to be human. I remove my hands, give her the smile I practiced before coming over, and turn to the screen. So a little time has passed now. The Minotaur ends up dating Brianna, and but then she's a grad student studying string theory, so she kind of is busy. So this is when she's doesn't have time for him. The Minotaur's co-workers take him for a drink. They say he's too mopey lately. The Minotaur doesn't want to go, but he's in the minority and gets voted down. His manager decides to make the outing mandatory, so they all pile in her Audi made for 4, but somehow holding more than that. The Minotaur cannot be called miniature, so it's a tight fit. If he were to measure the space left in the car, it'd be in millimeters. The manager, who goes by Megan R, since there are 2 Megans at the zoo, maneuvers her car into the only empty parking space at the Main Street bar. They unload and meander in. The Minotaur isn't sure how to maintain his cheer, but Shreya says alcohol is a great motivator. Jalen says he just needs to meditate or do Pilates and he'll be right as rain. The mirror glares when he asks, flips him the middle finger. The night progresses, they get drunker. Jalen moons over the bartender. Megan H. starts to talk about her mother. Shreya says she wanted to be a marine engineer. Zookeeper was as close as she got. There's a metaphor somewhere in that, she says, but the Minotaur is no mind reader and doesn't know where it is. He switches to mineral water in case he's not a happy drunk. He's worried he'll get meaner, commit a misdemeanor, or turn out to be a wasted man-eater. He pulls out his phone, finds Brianna's name, messages her, "I miss your face, why don't we talk anymore?" Before Shreya takes his phone, gives it to the bartender to monitor. Later, he stumbles out to meet his Uber driver, makes it in the door, falls into bed like a meteor. He dreams of red scarves woven into rope and climbed by a matador in mountaineer gear. That one, I was also playing with having every line end with a word that sounded similar to Minotaur. So it's a lot of the same, like M and R's and sounds in there. So that's all the ones that I'm going to read from my MFA collection, but I'm also currently working on turning it into a libretto along with Michaela McQueston, who's the one who arranged the chamber piece that was going to be at Carnegie. So these next two, they don't have titles because they're just excerpts from the libretto. The first one is when he's first released. I'm guessing by the screams my reputation precedes me, but that's no reason to skip the pleasantries. Should I start with a Cretan greeting sweeter than any poet ever wrote? Do we both bow or begin with a handshake? No? I don't really know the appropriate etiquette. I was never taught not to bite at first sight. Yes, that's a fault of mine. I make mistakes sometimes. After all, I'm only human, on my mother's side. You're speechless. Or do you lack speech? Have you never seen a family's black sheep? Have you never seen a centuries-old scapegoat? Cat got your tongue? Is there a frog in your throat? Oh, you want to address the elephant in the room. Why the long horns? My dad had 'em too. This one is a letter that he writes in therapy because his therapist thinks it'll help him work out some of his issues. It's to Daedalus, the guy who created the labyrinth and also the wooden cow that allowed his mom to have him. Dear Daedalus, do you mind if I call you Dad? You were a better one to someone than I ever had. Dear old Daedalus, the man most responsible for my birth, I will hold that fact against you for as long as I circle this earth. I hate you and I thank you. I'll never forgive you and might never kill you if old age catches you first. Dear Daedalus, if old age catches you first, will you come back down on waxen wings that are neither too hot nor too damp, or are you damned like I am, killed and still kicking? If so, wing on over and you and I can take another stab, another swing, piñata style, at that dying thing. And my final poem of the night, while still the Minotaur, was not written for either of those projects. It's just for fun. I write a poem a night every night in April, July, and November. And this one I wrote in April at the start of the pandemic. It's called The Minotaur in Quarantine. For me to social distance properly, shouldn't someone have ever come within 6 feet of me? It should be a change, shouldn't it? A choice? My Lady Macbeth hands are always clean these days. It doesn't pay to look dirty and be a monster. I'm having flashbacks of familiar paths and the walls are still walls when I wake. I couldn't tell you how air works, even if Theseus threatened kill me. What's the saying? Held a gun to my head. Although, be serious, we all know he'd pull the trigger no matter what I said. I couldn't tell you how air works. I don't know the science of how to be safe, and that's the scariest part. I, with my horns, my teeth, my back so used to walls that block attack, am confused by this invisible enemy. I walk in circles in my sleep, as I always have. I wake to walls, unpeopled as they ever were. Thank you. Yay.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So now we're going to move on to the discussion portion of the evening. So if anybody watching has any questions, feel free to write them in and we'll answer them. Thanks everybody in the comments. So Rana, do you have a question that you want to begin with?
Yeah, and I think this is something that you mentioned earlier about writing about trauma. And one thing that really struck me about your poem, Undressing My Mother, was just that awareness within the poem. Like, obviously, I think to a certain extent, all poets are aware, oh, I'm writing this stuff, somebody's going to read it, somebody I know is going to read it. But I love that you actually included that in the poem, in the tension of the poem, right? That she is going to read this. And I wanted to know why you decided to include that in the poem, and then how did you feel about that? I don't want to call it a realization, but I guess that knowledge.
Right. So that poem was actually written for an assignment for class. The assignment was to write a poem called My Mother's Nipples after Robert Haas. And so I had already told my parents about this assignment and that I had to write something called My Mother's Nipples. And then I sat down to write it. And I'm like, man, whatever I write, my mom's going to see. And I've told her about it. So she doubly is expecting it. And so it was very much on the mind as I was trying to figure out what I could say that wouldn't hurt anyone. And I ended up writing it, and then I shared it with my siblings, and they were like, "Mom can never see this. You have to go to your grave, and you cannot show either of our parents this ever." But I got it published online, and my mom Googled my name and found it a few months ago. So that didn't end up working out. But she was fine, so it was all right. But the awareness that this was something that she was going to read, because we do have I share all of my poems with her. I talk to her every day. I am currently in my parents' house. So we're close. So I knew that she would read it. So that is a challenge of how do you write about your relationship with people when they're the ones who are the ones most likely to read your poem about them. And I don't really have a good answer for it. Because it's just every poem's how do I need to be less specific so that they don't figure out that this is about this one argument we had, or should I lean into it because poetry is about, I don't know, trying to find a form of truth, I guess, and you just kind of got to balance it with every poem. How about you? You in writing about all of the Gulf War survivors, your challenge, did they read the poems that you wrote about them?
No, because none of those poems have been published.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no opportunity for them to really read it. I get asked every now and then, especially when I go back, if I'm not as much in touch with a lot of them as I was before, but every now and then I get asked, hey, what's going on with those poems? That one was a little strange for me because I feel like with that entire series, and I didn't know how to approach it. I feel like when it's your own trauma, when it's your own story, there's an ownership to it, obviously. And so you feel like you're able to do more, or at least I felt like I was able to do more with those sorts of poems that are derived from my life or from my experiences. But this was, I wasn't even born when the war happened. My mother was pregnant with me at the time. So, they're in spirit, I guess, depending on what you believe. So it wasn't my story at all to tell. And not only was I pestering people and trying to make them dig deep for things that were very traumatic for them, but then to turn it into essentially my art. And I was having a lot of trouble with ownership, which is why I think a lot of the poems ended up being in the form of discussions, right? A lot of the poems that I read, all of them are about, they're not even about the specific discussion, but they're about having the discussion. And so that was my way around it, because I ended up getting, with a lot of the poems, I wrote about 100 plus poems for this series, and I cut most of them. I cut down to about 20 poems because a lot of the others, they were literally just getting caught up in the viscera of the war, quite literally. Because in part of my research, I was getting, there were tons of images that I was looking at, video, things like that. You can like look up some of those videos on YouTube. And those images were just so striking. It's actually interesting with the Gulf War too. That was one of the first wars that was really televised. Like that was the rise of CNN, right? Shock and awe and all that. And so there's a lot of footage of just the brutality of it in many ways. And so I think I got very caught up in that, and my writing ended up just being a reflection of those things and not really going anywhere. So I don't know. I think it's, with any kind of trauma, whether it's your own or other people's, there's always this sort of negotiating. Where do you fall in, and how much are you willing to tell?
Right. And your way into that was through framing it with yourself as interviewee or interviewer. Yeah, that's really smart. Yeah, I feel like with my mom, like it's kind of a shared trauma in a way. And so it's like when it's like something that does belong to you but doesn't fully belong to you, that's where it's like difficult to talk about. And like with the Gulf War, it's also like it's a cultural trauma, so it does belong to you. It's just you don't want to like air other people's misery on for no reason. But it's not no reason, it's poetry. But yeah.
I think one thing, just to your point about like when it's trauma that involves other people, right? How do you characterize other people, right? And whose memory is more valid? Because the way you might remember something, the other person involved was, well, that's not what happened at all. And I think that oftentimes it's really hard, especially for me as a person who believes like in trying to get, like you said, as close to truth as possible, or a truth. I can kind of get in my own way and go like, well, there are like millions of other views here. Do you really want to write about this? Maybe you shouldn't.
Right. Yeah. After my mom read the poem, she was like, now it says that I had a bypass, but it wasn't actually a bypass. It was like and I'm like, okay, that's not that one word, like the B sounds better. We're going to leave it at bypass. And like, then we started talking about our memories of it, and everybody's memory was wildly different. So it's like memory is not truth, and so even though mine is what I thought happened, that doesn't mean it's what happened. And so like, there are facts, but then there are things that are fully subjective, and poetry can lean into the subjective, I think, without moving away from truth. Right? I don't know. It's a fine line to walk.
Yeah.
With other people.
I do want to switch gears a little bit. I want to ask you about that experience in your workshop and the question poem. I just want to know if you want to share the story. You don't have to share the story. Obviously, it's your story. But I'm just so curious. Like, they had a problem with so many questions in your poem?
Well, it wasn't just one poem, like I would bring in another poem like every week and they'd be like, oh, Nicole, more questions. So it was just, I feel like you can write towards questions or you can write towards answers. And I was writing towards questions, I guess. So like I kept ending, like all of the poems would be like question, 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 and never like answer anything. Or most of them end in questions, almost always. And so I didn't read a lot of the ones that, besides the one question one, that really illustrate that. But I do have a lot of questions. It is a thing that happens in a lot of my poems. So like they weren't wrong. But I was like, I don't know how to not write with questions. But my teacher was like, yeah, forget him. Just lean into it. And I feel like that's like really good advice for everything, is lean into it. Like if there's something you're doing that you're not sure if you want to be doing it, try doing it more and see if that works. But yeah, I don't know. Questions are I really admired in one of your poems how you ask a question, but then you end with a period and it doesn't feel like a question anymore by the time you get to the end of it. I think it was belief. Um, so it's like it's something like which one is better, this or that. But it doesn't feel like a question. It feels like an answer by the time you reach the end of it. And how do you decide on what like punctuation you use? Like a lot of your poems don't. It's not visible when you're reading it. So the people watching might not know this, but some of the poems don't have punctuation or it ends in a period instead of a question mark. How do you use punctuation in your poems?
I think for me, it's actually really funny. I was always terrible at grammar, like just absolutely terrible. And I think a part of it was because I grew up with 3 languages. So there was in my household, Urdu was spoken, Arabic was spoken. Obviously, Kuwait's an Arab country, so there's Arabic everywhere. And then I went to an American school, and I was primarily educated in English. But I would always mix up the different grammar rules. And like to this day, capitalization is terrible because in Arabic, there's no such thing as capitalization. It's just the position of the letter and where it falls in the word. And that's what changes its shape. So the concept of capitalization still to this day is very hard for me. And I think that sort of ignorance in a way freed me up to just play with things. And sometimes it's unconscious. With belief in particular, with that poem, I naturally ended it with a period. And then when I went back to revise, I was like, oh, this is grammatically incorrect. I should put a question mark. But I didn't like the question mark there. It's exactly as you said, like it wasn't really a question. I think I had already decided on the answer. And so it's really a case by case basis now that I'm better. Actually, the reason I'm better at grammar is because I was getting my teaching license and I wanted to teach English. And I thought, and part of the praxis test that you're supposed to take has a grammar section. I was like, oh, I better study. So I learned a ton of grammar and I got good at it. But I just think, the rules are, one of my teachers, Marvin Bell, he always says, like, learn the rules, break the rules, make new rules, break the rules. And so that's kind of how I approach it, is what fits the poem, what fits the tone or the content that I'm trying to portray.
Yeah. And poetry, I think, has a lot of room to play in those ways, like with grammar or with capitalization or punctuation. Like if you leave it out, it's intentional, Yeah. It doesn't have to be right as long as it fits. So I think what you're doing with that is really interesting. Speaking of other things that don't show up when you're reading, I want to talk about your line breaks. Like there were a couple that I really adored that like set the tone for your poems really well. Like in When Asked, it says he didn't want to go back, and then there's a line break and it says 20 years. And so that he didn't want to go back is really different than he didn't want to go back 20 years. Or in Off the Knife, it says, I chopped heads, and then there's a line break, or feats of carrots. And so like both of those have, like they create this more ominous tone to it that you might not notice if you're reading it out loud. Could you talk maybe a little bit about how you decide where to break lines?
I think in like the first draft, it's really intuitive, and I think that's true for like most poets. I had a great teacher whose voice is basically like a what I think of putting on my editor voice. Like her voice is part of that editor voice. Her name is Monica Berlin. She's a poet, and I remember because I worked on the series with her. She literally would sit with my poems and like move around lines and play with them in a way that I'd never played with line before, and line breaks and things. And so I think, you're always told, I think anyone who writes poetry, you're always told like the line is a unit, like it's its own unit, and you have to look at it that way. And I've heard that over and over throughout all my writing in academia, I guess. But I never understood it. And I didn't understand it until I was sitting with her and watching her move around the words and the lines. And I realized, like, oh yeah, I can make this anything I want. That's pretty cool. Um, and so when I look at line now, like after the initial just right through, I look at shape. I look at how it falls on the page, and then one thing that I like to do, and Off the Knife was actually really just about that, was like, how many surprises can I make in my line breaks? And I intentionally did that. I was like, I want to set up an expectation and then break it in the next line. And so that's where those came from.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the main things that I look for in poetry is patterns and where the patterns break. And so I think that really ties into line breaks as well. I think the way that I tend to look at them, like you said, is like something when it does something new, like to make surprises. So like since poems often end in like rhymes, I use a lot of rhymes, but I tend to make them not at the end of the lines always, because I figure like people naturally think will already stress the rhyming words, so you don't need it to be on the end. And people already stress like the beginnings of sentences, and people already stress like where the start of the line and the end of the line. So if your sentence is naturally stressed in one way, if you put the natural stresses not in the places where people will stress it because of the line breaks, then you can stress other words, I guess. So I like to do that sometimes, like you said, with the surprises.
Yeah. Actually, with the poem that you read that has the rhyme in it, when I first read it, I didn't notice the rhyme at all. It totally went over my head. And then I read it a second time and I was like, wait, this rhymes with that. And it was so great because I don't work in rhyme. I'm not very good at it, but like that's the honest way to say it. I'm not very good at it. And I feel like the people who are most successful with rhyme, they really understand what you're saying, like how people speak, how we stress things, how we read. And it blew my mind actually to find so many rhymes in that poem that I just completely missed. And I think it added something to the rhythm, because when I first read it, I was like, oh, this rhythm's very strong. It's like, how is this being accomplished? And then when I read it again, I was like, I see how the rhyme is creating this music, even though it's not like where we traditionally assume rhyme will go, which is at the end of the line.
Thank you. Yeah, I do the same. It helps me in the same way when I'm writing it. So like you, where you're reading it, where you're like, it helps lead from here to there and it builds this music. Like when you're writing it, it's like, oh, I can't think of what I want to say next, but this word would sound good. How do we get to that word? Kind of a thing. So you can use rhyme and I think form in the same way, where you can be like, I have this box that I'm kind of using as a jumping, as a leap into something else. So that's kind of how I tend to think of rhyme and form, is just a way to get to the next thought that is already partially created for me.
That's a great way to look at it. Actually, I might use that as an exercise, and just because I don't usually write in rhyme, but that makes me excited to try it. I was gonna ask about your Minotaur poem. I think it's the Minotaur visits his mother, and it's at that shape. So obviously, viewers don't see the poem, but it's in like a triangle shape, right? What made you decide to go with that shape, and what do you think? Because I kind of have my own theories of what the shape means to the poem, like as a reader. But I wanted to know what your impulse was behind that shape.
Yeah, I guess it was a couple years ago, so I'm trying to remember what my thought process was. I think that I wanted it to feel sharper, because it's like the carving of the turkey, and it's also like a build towards something before like he's brought back. But I showed it, so I was thinking of it as kind of a knife, even though it doesn't look, it's like a lot wider than a knife would be. But I showed it to my teacher, Joy, and she was like, oh, it's the mother's breast. Yes, that makes perfect sense. And I was like, oh, that's not what I intended, but that works. So like whatever connections people want to draw is great. But I think I was just trying to make it was like, I feel like I wanted it to be a sharp slope, I guess, so that it like pulled you forward and then And I was just playing, you know. I think poetry should be play.
Yeah, I think that's what drew me to poetry, was that it was, because I started off writing fiction, and I think I said this when I was talking to Kim about the Choose Your Own Adventure book. Like, I hated poetry when I first was writing. I absolutely despised it, and I think it was because I didn't understand that it was really about playing with language and with words. And I'm really glad that you said the whole closer to the point, because that's what I thought. I thought it was really cool that it was like they were getting closer and closer and closer to this unsaid thing between them. But then, like, there's that fear, and then you go back. So that's really cool. And I love the mother's breast thing.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that one at all. But Joy thinks differently than me, but she's right in her own way. But so how did you come to poetry if you didn't like it before?
So I started off writing from a very young age, and I would write little short stories and things. Like, my mom had bought my older sister and I some diaries, and I never used it as a diary. I used it to write stories in, because, like, my diary, literally there's a diary entry where I actually tried to use it as a diary. I said, I ate a cookie today. Like, the end. That was my life. I ate a cookie. Thank you. But I loved fiction. I loved writing, and I found that I was very naturally drawn to it. And then the first poem I ever wrote that wasn't like for a class, because obviously, little kids are forced to write poetry all the time.
Right.
But the first poem I ever wrote was actually after 9/11. And I don't know why I was in 5th grade at the time. I don't know why I was drawn to writing a poem about this event. It was very juvenile. Like, I think there was like a line in there, like, people are fighting like small sisters and brothers, or something like that. I was just trying to process what had happened. But then I didn't return to poetry for a very long time. And a lot of it, I think, and as an English teacher myself, I think a lot of the ways poetry is taught just turns kids off from it. And I was definitely turned off from it. And it wasn't until I went to, I attended Interlochen Arts Academy, which is an arts boarding high school in Northern Michigan. And when I got there and I was working with teachers who were also writers, and poets specifically, like, I really started to understand what you can do with poetry. And that made me excited, because I love fiction still, and I still write fiction, obviously, but you don't get to play, I think, with the unit of the word as much in fiction as you could in poetry.
Yeah.
How about you? What drew you to poetry?
I mean, my grandmom was an English teacher, and my granddad wrote poetry, and so it was just like always around. Like, we have like my Angelou collections like all along the wall growing up, and actually, like, right outside my bedroom there's like a framed Edgar Allan Poe poem. So I like literally passed a poem every day coming in and out of my room. So I just like memorized that one from a young age, and I don't know, I liked it. I liked the way words sound. So I just kept doing it. And like you said, writing in class where little kids are forced to write poems and their things, I enjoyed those. And so I did more of them on my free time, and here we are. I also feel like I tend to gravitate towards the less practical things. So like, there's journalism and there's English, and I got a degree in English, and then it's like, how can I be less practical than being an English? So I got an MFA in poetry, and here I am. So it's play, it's language, and I've always been surrounded by it and by people who respect it as an art form. So it gives you room to also respect it and play in it. Okay, so it looks like we're running down our time. So I wanted to ask, what are some things that you would recommend that people read now or reach out to in this time?
Okay, the first one you probably should not reach out to in this time of quarantine and isolation. But this is the book that really turned me into a poet, which is why I wanted to mention this. And this poet is just a huge figure in my life. Actually, all of my poems, but especially my earlier poems, they all started out as letters to him in response to this book. So the book is Letters to Yesenin, by Jim Harrison. And so basically Jim Harrison is an American poet who in the 70s was writing poems that were letters to Yesenin, who was a Russian poet in, I think, I want to say 1920s-ish, who committed suicide. And so Harrison is going through his own period of depression and isolation, and he's contemplating suicide. And so these poems were basically his way to write out of it. And then when I read them, I was in high school, and I have a history of depression and suicide, or suicidal thoughts. History of suicide, I wouldn't be here then. But I just absolutely love these poems, and I love Jim Harrison's work all across the board, but this book is sacred to me, and I highly recommend it. So that's one. I mentioned Monica Berlin earlier. This is her latest book, Elsewhere That's Small. Absolutely, anyone who's gotten a chance to work with Monica knows that she's amazing, and I'm so excited to see, this is her second book, I'm so excited to get to share that with people, and just highly recommend. What she does with line is very interesting. What she does with rhythm and her voice is just astounding. Another teacher of mine here. And Monica works at Knox College, so shout out to Knox College. I mean, Knoxies listening, but Gina Franco is another teacher there who I worked with, and this is her latest book, The Accidental. Amazing. Just absolutely beautiful. And she had a panel last year at AWP that was all about taking your time with poetry that I thought was really important, and like you can tell the effort and the time that she put into this book. It's just so gorgeous. I think there are books that just stay with you, and this one has definitely stayed with me. Should I keep? Am I good, or
however many you want to do? That works.
Okay, cool. I'll do these two next. This one is We Play a Game by Zwiz Joan. Sorry, Zwi, if I said your name wrong. But absolutely beautiful. Zwi's just a phenomenal poet. He's also a friend, so hi, Zwi. But it's just, I think he plays with language, and the really cool thing about this is that he is bilingual, and so there is Vietnamese and English, and they play together, like, I mean, not just in content, but also like in rhythm and sound. And that is really fun, especially for other poets who speak multiple languages. I feel like if you want to look at samples of how to incorporate that into your poetry, it's a great book. And this other one is, this one I'm in love with. I'm obsessed with, Documents by Jen Henry Gray. I don't know how to explain this other than to say, like, there is a poem in here that literally has ISBN numbers. It's so creative and beautiful, like, and the content is just amazing. So, a queer, undocumented Filipino writer, also friend, so hi, Jan. Absolutely phenomenal book. I cannot recommend it enough. I think I will end with this one. Actually, I have some others, but I'll end with this one. This is, so Jericho Brown, everyone knows he's amazing. And I have all of his books, and I love all of his books. But this book will always be sacred to me. This is Please. And I read this in college, and it was the first time that I'd read about someone, or that I'd read someone writing about their experience of being abused or of abuse in a way that didn't fall into sort of this monster-victim dichotomy. And that was so refreshing to me because I needed to see that in order for me to move on in my work. So poems, Please, these poems, and what's it? Prayer for the Backhanded, I think. Yeah, Prayer of the Backhanded is my favorite poem in the collection. It's opened so many doors for me. So, yeah.
A couple that I would recommend are these two. I read like in the middle of writing the Minotaur and after writing the Minotaur, and I was like, why am I writing this? They already did it better. Like Autobiography of Red is about a Greek monster in the modern day. And it's fantastic. Everything Anne Carson does, she's an absolute genius. And then Deaf Republic is like a play happening in poetry form. Like there's a cast of characters, and it's like exactly what I want to do is just a mix of these two books. Another one I would highly recommend is White Egrets by Derek Walcott. I went to Italy for a semester, and I could only bring like a certain number of books, and this is one that I took with me because I could not imagine leaving it behind. I love all of the poems in here. And then here's one that I read for school, but it was just like amazing. Olio. I was home that weekend, and I kept having to interrupt both of my parents in whatever they were doing and be like, no, listen to this and also look at it, because I have to share it somehow because it's amazing. Like he does these things where they're like, you can read them across or down or in like so many different ways. So you have to read each poem like 4 times, but it's worth it. So all of those are amazing. I have more that I would recommend, but I lent most of them to my sister because I recommend them to people. So we'll just stick with those right now. I did want to answer one question that somebody asked in the comments really fast. Let's see. Girly Film Society says, I love reading poetry, but hate writing it. It makes me anxious. I'm afraid of putting myself out there. Do you guys have any tips? Do you have tips for somebody about writing poetry?
Well, first of all, I want to say I feel you. I hear you. I was in that position myself. And to a certain extent, I'm still uncomfortable sharing my poetry. I mean, this is the first poetry. I was telling Nicole this before we started. This is my first poetry reading in like 5 years. So I don't put myself out there in terms of poetry. But what I would say is start small, right? Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Don't feel like you need to be the next Jericho Brown or something, right? Like, write a line and play with it, and actually this is a great, I got this from another teacher of mine, Eduardo Corral, where he will just write a line and then he'll write a variation of that line right under it, and he'll just keep going and just keep writing variations, and then from that, by the end, you have a poem. You can just like judge it up or fix it or whatever you want to do with it, but I think starting small is a good way to get into it.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that helps.
Yeah, you don't have to tackle every injustice in the world all at once, like start with something around you and write about that. Or if like sharing it is the issue, I mean, as long as you're writing it, you don't have to share it with anyone. Or you could put it like online where it's just strangers reading it, or have one person that you like share poems with and swap. So then you're both being vulnerable.
Or a pen name.
That might help. Yeah. That's true. Don't put your name on it.
Yeah, just another name. I have a pen name. I'm not going to say what it's for, but I have one.
Yeah, I mean, on my Tumblr, my name's not on it, so it's less pressure, So take the pressure off and then write for fun. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's everything. So thank you so much for joining us, Rana, and everybody watching. And you can come back next week for our other poets, who are Greg Santos and Bunkang Tuan. So we'll all see you then. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.